Billionaire comes home early and can't believe what he sees. Picture this. You're a billionaire pharmaceutical mogul who spent 8 years and millions trying to heal your disabled son, only to discover that your minimum wage housekeeper possesses healing powers beyond anything medical science can achieve. Robert Sterling's world exploded when he came home early to find his son Timothy, born with weak legs and dependent on crutches, literally walking on water across their swimming pool while their black housekeeper Grace guided him through an impossible miracle. But Grace Washington wasn't just any domestic worker. She was a seventh-generation traditional healer whose grandmother had taught her to cure what hospitals couldn't touch. As Timothy danced and ran across a blessed cloth stretched over holy water, his father realized that the woman he'd been paying to clean toilets was worth more than his entire medical fortune. This is the story of how one family's miracle shattered a pharmaceutical empire and revealed a hidden network of healers who'd been quietly working miracles while mainstream medicine failed those who needed hope most. Robert Sterling's Bentley crunched over the gravel driveway of his Connecticut estate 3 hours earlier than expected, the emergency board meeting having been canceled when merger documents arrived incomplete from Hong Kong. The pharmaceutical mogul loosened his Italian silk tie as he approached the mansion's front entrance, already mentally preparing for an evening of reviewing quarterly reports in his study. "Mr. Sterling, you're home early," called his personal assistant through the intercom system, surprise evident in her voice. "Shall I have Margaret prepare dinner for 7 instead of 10? Robert waved dismissively at the security camera, his mind still occupied with the failed acquisition that had dominated his thoughts for weeks. "No changes necessary, Patricia. I'll be in my study until the usual time." He paused at the mahogany front door, fishing for his keys while wondering why the house seemed unusually quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. His son Timothy should have been home from his specialized school by now, and their housekeeper Grace typically had music playing while she worked in the afternoons. The silence felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made Robert's business instincts prickle with unease. As he stepped into the marble foyer, he could hear faint voices coming from the direction of the pool area, though he couldn't make out the words over the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. Something in those distant voices made him pause, a quality he couldn't identify that drew him toward the back of the house instead of up the grand staircase to his study. Robert moved through the house with uncharacteristic stealth, his expensive leather shoes silent on the Persian rugs as he followed the sound of conversation toward the pool area. As he approached the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the backyard, he could see his 8-year-old son Timothy sitting at the edge of the pool, his legs dangling in the water while his crutches lay nearby on the stone deck. "Miss Grace," Timothy was saying, his young voice filled with excitement. "Are you sure this will work? I've been trying to walk normal for so long, and the doctors say maybe never." Grace Washington, their housekeeper of 5 years, knelt beside a large tarp that she had spread across the surface of the pool, her dark hands smoothing the waterproof fabric with practiced precision. "Baby, your grandmama's spirit came to me in a dream last night," Grace replied, her Louisiana accent thick with emotion and conviction. "She showed me how her own grandmother used to help children with weak legs back in the old country. This here cloth has been blessed by 7 different prayer circles, soaked in holy water from 3 churches, and charged under the full moon for healing." Robert pressed himself against the window frame, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold, torn between scientific skepticism and desperate hope for his disabled son. Timothy had been born with a rare muscular condition that left his legs weak and unstable, requiring crutches for mobility despite years of the most expensive treatments money could buy. "The water's going to hold me up?" Timothy asked, his eyes wide with wonder as he stared at the tarp stretched tight across the pool surface. Grace's weathered hands helped Timothy to his feet, supporting him with surprising strength as she guided him toward the edge of the tarp-covered pool. "Not the water, child," she said softly, her voice carrying generations of folk wisdom and spiritual power. "The faith, the love, the prayers of all the women in my family who've been watching over you since you first came to this house." Robert watched in fascination as Grace began to hum a melody he didn't recognize, something that sounded like a spiritual crossed with a lullaby, her voice rising and falling with hypnotic rhythm. Timothy's face was wrapped with concentration as he placed one tentative foot on the tarp, then another, his small body trembling with effort and anticipation. "I can feel it, Miss Grace," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's like the cloth is alive under my feet." Robert's analytical mind raced to find rational explanations for what he was witnessing, but his father's heart simply marveled at the joy spreading across his son's face. The tarp did seem to respond to Timothy's weight differently than physics would suggest, supporting him not just physically, but somehow spiritually, as if Grace's faith and love had literally transformed ordinary material into something miraculous. As Timothy took his first independent steps across the water, his movement fluid and confident in a way Robert had never seen, tears began streaming down the billionaire's face as he realized he was witnessing something that transcended the boundaries between science and magic, between the possible and the impossible. The transformation in Timothy's movement was so dramatic that Robert initially wondered if he was hallucinating from the stress of recent business dealings. But the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. His son, who had never walked more than a few steps without crutches or assistance, was now moving across the tarp-covered pool with the grace and confidence of a professional dancer. "Miss Grace, I'm really doing it," Timothy called out, his laughter echoing across the water as he executed a perfect turn and began walking back toward the pool's edge. "I can feel my legs getting stronger with every step." Grace stood at the poolside with tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped in prayer as she watched the miracle unfold. "Thank you, Jesus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Timothy's joyful exclamations. "Thank you for using these old hands to bring healing to this precious child." Robert pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The tarp appeared to be responding to Timothy's faith and Grace's prayers, becoming somehow more substantial and supportive with each step, as if the combined power of their belief was literally altering the physical properties of matter. When Timothy reached the center of the pool and began jumping up and down on the tarp, his legs strong and stable in a way they had never been on solid ground, Robert knew he was witnessing something that would challenge every assumption he had ever made about reality, medicine, and the power of faith to heal what science had deemed incurable. The revelation that his son's healing was connected to Grace's spiritual practices forced Robert to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of his wealth and the Western medical establishment he had always trusted. As Timothy continued his miraculous walk across the water, Robert remembered the dozens of specialists they had consulted, the experimental treatments they had tried, the millions of dollars he had spent searching for a cure that money apparently couldn't buy. "Daddy always says the best doctors in the world can't fix my legs," Timothy called out to Grace as he practiced balancing on one foot atop the mystical tarp. "But you did it with just a cloth and some prayers. How come the smart doctors couldn't do what you did?" Grace's answer cut through Robert's heart like a blade forged from truth and humility. "Because, baby, some kinds of healing don't come from knowing things with your head. They come from believing things with your heart, and from letting love flow through you to touch places that medicine can't reach." Robert realized that in his obsession with finding a scientific solution to Timothy's condition, he had overlooked the healing power that had been present in his own home all along, embodied in a woman whose ancestors had carried knowledge and abilities that his Harvard MBA and pharmaceutical connections couldn't match. The sight of his son walking on water, literally walking on water, forced him to acknowledge that there were forms of wealth and power that existed beyond his considerable financial resources, and that the woman he had been paying to clean his house possessed gifts that were infinitely more valuable than anything in his stock portfolio. As Timothy completed his 10th lap across the tarp-covered pool, his legs growing visibly stronger and more coordinated with each crossing, Grace began to explain the spiritual principles underlying the miracle they were witnessing. "Your grandmama's spirit told me that this child's legs aren't broken, Mr. Sterling," she said, somehow aware that Robert was watching from the window despite never looking in his direction. They're just sleeping, waiting for the right kind of wake-up call. Sometimes the body needs more than medicine to remember how to be whole. Robert stepped back from the window in shock, realizing that Grace had known he was there all along. But her attention remained focused on Timothy as he experimented with running and jumping on the miraculous surface. The tarp isn't magic by itself, Grace continued, her voice carrying the authority of generations of folk healers. It's just cotton and waterproofing, same as any other cloth. But when you soak it in prayer and love, when you stretch it across water that's been blessed by women who've spent their whole lives healing children, when you invite God's Spirit to work through human hands and hearts. She paused, watching Timothy attempt a cartwheel on the floating surface, his movement graceful and strong. Well, then you get to see what's possible when heaven and earth work together for healing. Robert found himself opening the sliding door and stepping onto the pool deck, no longer able to remain a hidden observer of the miracle taking place in his own backyard. "Grace," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "how long have you known that you could do this?" Grace turned to face Robert with eyes that held depths of wisdom and compassion that seemed impossible for someone he had categorized simply as the help for 5 years. "Mr. Sterling," she said gently, "I've been waiting for the right time to show Timothy this gift ever since I first saw him struggling with those crutches. But healing like this can't be forced or rushed. It has to unfold when the heart is ready to receive it, when the spirit is ready to believe." Timothy, still walking confidently on the tarp, waved excitedly at his father. "Daddy, look what Miss Grace taught me. I can walk on water just like in the Bible stories." Robert approached the pool's edge with trembling legs, his own steps less steady than his son's miraculous ones. "Timothy, how do you feel? Does it hurt? Are you tired?" he asked, his paternal concern warring with his amazement at what he was witnessing. Timothy shook his head vigorously, his face glowing with joy and energy. "I feel stronger than I've ever felt, Daddy. My legs feel like they remember how to work the right way." Grace placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder, her touch somehow conveying decades of patient love and spiritual strength. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Sterling. Timothy's healing is going to continue as long as he keeps believing and as long as we keep supporting him with love and prayer. But there's something else you need to know about what's happening here." Her voice took on a more serious tone that made Robert's attention sharpen. "This kind of healing comes with responsibilities. Timothy's not just getting his legs back. He's being called to use his gift to help other children who are struggling with things that regular medicine can't fix." The implications of Timothy's miraculous healing began to unfold over the following hours as Grace explained the spiritual tradition she represented and the network of healers who had guided her work with children across the South for over 3 decades. "My grandmother was a root doctor back in Louisiana," Grace told Robert as they sat by the pool, while Timothy continued to practice walking and running on the mystical tarp. "She could heal things that doctors couldn't even diagnose, using nothing but plants from the bayou and prayers passed down through generations of women who remembered the old ways." Robert listened with growing fascination as Grace described a parallel medical system that operated through faith, community support, and knowledge that had been preserved outside of universities and hospitals. "When I first came to work for your family, I could see that Timothy's condition wasn't just physical," Grace continued, her eyes following the boy's joyful movements across the water. "There was a spiritual component that needed healing too, a sense of being separate from other children, cut off from the full life he was meant to live. The tarp ceremony isn't just about strengthening his muscles. It's about reconnecting him to his own power and purpose." As the sun began to set over the Connecticut estate, casting golden light across the pool where a miracle was still unfolding, Robert realized that his understanding of healing, power, and wealth was being fundamentally transformed. The woman he had hired to maintain his household had revealed herself to be a healer whose abilities surpassed anything his money could buy, and his son was walking on water with the faith and joy of someone who had discovered that the impossible was simply another word for not yet understood. Grace Washington had been observing the Sterling family dynamics for 5 years. Her trained healer's intuition picking up on energies and patterns that the wealthy household's other staff members missed entirely. During her daily cleaning routines, she had watched Robert's increasing desperation as Timothy's condition failed to improve despite the parade of specialists, experimental treatments, and cutting-edge therapies that money could provide. "Lord, this man's heart is breaking a little more each day," Grace would whisper during her evening prayers, her weathered hands folded over worn Bible pages as she sought guidance about when and how to reveal the gifts that her grandmother had passed down through 3 generations of root doctors and folk healers. She had seen similar cases before in her native Louisiana, children whose physical ailments were tangled up with spiritual blockages that required a different kind of medicine than what hospitals could offer. Timothy's bright spirit and gentle nature had reminded her immediately of her own nephew Marcus, who had been healed of a similar muscular condition through the same water-walking ceremony that she was now preparing to share with the Sterling family. Some healing got to come from the community her grandmother had always taught her, and some got to come from the individual spirit finding its power. But the deepest healing, child, that comes from the meeting place between heaven and earth, where love flows through human hands to touch what medicine can't reach. Grace had been praying for 3 months for the right moment to approach Timothy's healing, waiting for the spiritual confirmation that would tell her when his heart was ready to receive what she had to offer. The network of healing women that Grace belonged to stretched across the American South like invisible threads connecting churches, beauty salons, community centers, and private homes where traditional medicine was practiced alongside prayer and community support. Sister Mary Catherine in Atlanta had been the first to suggest that Timothy's healing might require the water-walking ceremony, her own gift of spiritual sight allowing her to see across distance that the boy's condition was being held in place by fear rather than just genetics. "That child's legs aren't the real problem," Sister Mary had told Grace during their monthly phone circle with healers from 7 states. "The real problem is that he's forgotten how to trust his own power, forgotten that God made him to walk and run and dance like any other child." The prescription that emerged from their collective prayer session was specific. Blessed cloth stretched across holy water, prayers from multiple circles, and most importantly, the presence of someone who could hold absolute faith in the boy's healing while he learned to believe it himself. Grace had spent weeks preparing for the ceremony, collecting blessed water from churches throughout Connecticut, soaking the ceremonial cloth in prayers and intentions gathered from her extended spiritual family, and waiting for the divine timing that would bring everything together for Timothy's miracle. When she woke up that Tuesday morning with an unusual sense of urgency and anticipation, she knew that the day she had been preparing for had finally arrived. The revelation of Grace's true identity as a traditional healer forced Robert to confront his own assumptions about intelligence, education, and the sources of real wisdom in a world that often dismissed folk knowledge as superstition. "Mr. Sterling," Grace said as she helped Timothy down from the tarp after his first successful session, "there's things I need to tell you about who I really am and why I came to work for your family." Robert settled into a pool chair, his business-trained mind struggling to process the cognitive dissonance between the miracle he had just witnessed and his rational worldview. Grace pulled out a worn leather journal filled with handwritten notes, pressed flowers, and faded photographs that documented decades of healing work. "My real name is Grace Washington Baptiste, and I'm the 7th generation of women in my family to carry the gift of spiritual healing," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had kept profound secrets for years. "I didn't come to Connecticut looking for housekeeping work. I came because the spirits told me there was a child here who needed healing that money couldn't buy." The journal contained testimonials from hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed by Grace's interventions. Children who had learned to walk, adults who had overcome addiction, families who had been reconciled after years of bitter separation. "Every case is different," Grace explained, "but they all have one thing in common. They required someone to believe in healing when the person who needed it had lost the ability to believe in themselves." Robert's investigation into Grace's background, conducted with the same thoroughness he applied to business acquisitions, revealed a woman whose healing reputation extended far beyond what he had ever imagined possible for someone working as domestic help. Dr. James Morrison, a retired pediatric neurologist from Tulane University, confirmed that he had referred dozens of patients to Grace over his 30-year career, always unofficially and always after conventional medicine had exhausted its options. Grace Washington is one of the most gifted healers I've ever encountered. Dr. Morrison told Robert during a phone conversation that challenged everything the billionaire thought he knew about medical practice. I can't explain how she does what she does from a scientific standpoint, but I've seen her help children recover from conditions that we had labeled as permanent disabilities. She has an intuitive understanding of the connection between emotional trauma and physical symptoms that surpasses anything I learned in medical school. The testimonials that Robert uncovered painted a picture of a woman who had chosen to work a domestic service, not because of limited options, but as a form of ministry that allowed her to be present in homes where healing was needed most. She always said that the families with the most money often had the deepest wounds, recalled Reverend Patricia Johnson, pastor of the Baptist Church, where Grace had volunteered for community healing circles. Rich folks got just as much pain as poor folks, sometimes more, because they got the resources to avoid dealing with their problems instead of healing them. Grace saw working in wealthy households as her calling to bring spiritual medicine to people who didn't even know they needed it. The discovery that Timothy's healing was part of a larger pattern of miracles that Grace had facilitated throughout her career forced Robert to reconsider his understanding of coincidence, destiny, and the invisible forces that might have guided their housekeeper to his family's door 5 years earlier. Grace's journal contained an entry dated exactly 1 week before she had responded to their employment advertisement, describing a vivid dream in which she saw a blond boy with crutches walking across water while his father watched from behind glass. The Spirit showed me that this child's healing would open doorways for many other families who had lost hope. Grace had written in her careful script. His father's heart needs healing too, but in a different way. He needs to learn that love is more powerful than money, and that some blessings can't be bought or controlled. Robert realized that his family's healing had been orchestrated by forces beyond his comprehension, and that Grace's presence in their lives represented a form of divine intervention that his materialistic worldview had never allowed him to consider. As Timothy continued to practice his water walking skills over the following days, his strength and coordination improving with each session, Robert began to understand that his son's miracle was not an isolated event, but part of a larger tapestry of healing that Grace had been weaving throughout her life. The woman he had been paying minimum wage to clean his bathrooms was revealed to be a master healer, whose gifts were worth more than his entire pharmaceutical fortune, and whose presence in his home had been orchestrated by spiritual forces that were far more powerful than any business strategy he had ever devised. The transformation in Robert's worldview accelerated as he witnessed not just Timothy's physical healing, but the profound changes that the miracle had catalyzed throughout their entire household and extended family. Timothy's mother, Catherine, who had been struggling with depression and guilt over her son's condition, experienced her own form of healing as she watched her boy discover his full potential through Grace's intervention. I blamed myself for Timothy's legs, Catherine confessed to Grace during a tearful conversation by the pool, thinking that something I did wrong during pregnancy caused his problems. Grace's response carried the wisdom of someone who had counseled hundreds of parents through similar guilt. Honey, some children come into this world with challenges because their spirits are strong enough to handle them, and because their healing is meant to be a blessing not just for them, but for everyone who loves them. Timothy's legs weren't a punishment or a mistake. They were an invitation for all of us to discover what's possible when we combine medical knowledge with spiritual power. The extended Sterling family, including Robert's elderly father and his siblings who had watched Timothy's struggles with helpless concern, found themselves drawn into a new understanding of healing that bridged the gap between their privileged backgrounds and the folk wisdom that Grace represented. Sunday dinners at the estate became informal healing circles where Grace would share stories from her tradition while family members contributed their own experiences of overcoming challenges through faith, community support, and the willingness to believe in possibilities that logic couldn't explain. The ripple effects of Timothy's healing began to extend beyond the Sterling family as word spread through their affluent Connecticut community about the miraculous recovery that had taken place at their estate. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Timothy's longtime pediatric neurologist, requested a private meeting with Grace after examining the boy and finding muscle tone and coordination that defied everything she understood about his original condition. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of practice," Dr. Harper admitted to Grace and Robert during their consultation. "Timothy's muscle development has advanced more in the past month than it did in the previous 8 years combined. From a medical standpoint, this kind of improvement is impossible without surgical intervention or pharmaceutical treatment that I know he hasn't received." Grace's explanation of the spiritual healing process initially challenged Dr. Harper's scientific training, but the evidence of Timothy's transformation was undeniable. "I'm not asking you to abandon your medical knowledge," Grace told the doctor gently, "but I am asking you to consider that there might be forms of healing that work alongside medicine instead of replacing it." Timothy's body was always capable of this kind of function. It just needed the right kind of encouragement to remember how to access its full potential. The conversation marked the beginning of Dr. Harper's journey into integrative medicine, as she began referring selected patients to Grace for complementary spiritual healing while maintaining her conventional treatment protocols. The media attention that eventually surrounded Timothy's story transformed Grace from an anonymous domestic worker into a reluctant celebrity whose healing methods became the subject of documentary films, academic studies, and international conferences on alternative medicine. "I never wanted to be famous," Grace told Robert as they dealt with interview requests from reporters around the world. "But if Timothy's story can help other families find hope when doctors say there's nothing more they can do, then I guess the Lord's got plans that are bigger than my comfort zone." The Sterling family's decision to share their experience publicly, despite the potential skepticism from their social and business circles, created opportunities for other children with similar conditions to receive healing through Grace's methods. The Grace Washington Center for Spiritual Healing, funded by Robert's pharmaceutical fortune and staffed by traditional healers from across the country, became a model for integrating folk medicine with conventional medical care. Timothy himself, now walking and running with the confidence and strength of any healthy child, became an advocate for children with disabilities and a living testament to the power of faith, love, and community to heal what money and medicine alone could not touch. His transformation from a boy who struggled with crutches to a young athlete who could literally walk on water became a symbol of hope for families around the world who were searching for miracles in the meeting place between heaven and earth. The physics of Timothy's water walking defied every scientific principle that Robert's pharmaceutical background had taught him to trust, yet the evidence before his eyes was undeniable as he watched his son complete his 20th consecutive lap across the tarp-covered pool without showing any signs of fatigue. "Grace, I need to understand what's actually happening here," Roberts said, his analytical mind desperate to find rational explanations for the impossible. "Is the tarp somehow solid? Is there a hidden platform? Some kind of chemical treatment that changes the water's density?" Grace smiled with the patient tolerance of someone accustomed to skeptical questions from educated people who had never witnessed spiritual healing. "Mr. Sterling, you're asking the wrong questions," she replied gently, her eyes never leaving Timothy as he practiced jumping and spinning on the mystical surface. "The tarp is just regular canvas, and the water is just water from your own pool. What you're seeing isn't about changing the physical properties of matter. It's about faith creating possibilities that science hasn't learned to measure yet." Timothy called out from the center of the pool, his voice bubbling with joy and wonder. "Daddy, it's not like walking on something solid. It's more like the water wants to hold me up, like it's happy to help me walk." Robert pulled out his phone and began recording, thinking that video evidence might help him process what he was witnessing, but the camera seemed unable to capture the full reality of what was happening before his eyes. The phenomenon intensified as Timothy's confidence grew, with the tarp responding to his faith and Grace's prayers in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of material science. when Timothy attempted his first dance move on the water surface, a spinning jump that should have torn through the canvas or at least destabilized his balance. The tarp seemed to anticipate and accommodate his movement with supernatural precision. "Miss Grace, look at this!" Timothy shouted as he executed a perfect pirouette, the water beneath the cloth creating gentle swells that supported his landing and propelled him into his next movement. Grace clapped her hands in delight, her own faith validated by the expanding scope of the miracle. "That's right, baby. When you trust completely, when you let go of fear and doubt, the whole universe wants to dance with you." Robert watched in amazement as Timothy began incorporating increasingly complex movements into his water-walking routine, including backflips and cartwheels that would have been challenging on solid ground, let alone on a floating piece of cloth. The tarp responded to each movement as if it were alive and consciously cooperating with the boy's faith, creating firm footing where it was needed while yielding gracefully to absorb the impact of his landings. "This is impossible," Robert whispered to himself, but his words were drowned out by Timothy's laughter echoing across the water as he discovered new dimensions of physical freedom that his disability had never allowed him to experience. The spiritual dimension of Timothy's water walking became even more apparent as Grace began teaching him traditional hymns and prayers that seemed to enhance his stability and confidence on the mystical surface. "When your heart is full of praise and gratitude," Grace explained as they sang together, "your whole body remembers that it was made to be strong and free." Timothy's voice joined with Grace's in a rendition of "Wade in the Water" that seemed to make the tarp glow with its own inner light, the surface becoming increasingly responsive to his movements as the spiritual energy of the song flowed through both of them. Robert found himself unconsciously swaying to the rhythm, his business-hardened heart opening to forms of beauty and power that his corporate life had never allowed him to experience. "Daddy, come sing with us," Timothy called out, gesturing for his father to join the impromptu worship service taking place on the water. The song makes everything feel stronger and brighter. Robert hesitated, his self-consciousness warring with his desire to participate in his son's miracle, but Grace's encouraging smile gave him the courage to add his untrained voice to their spiritual duet. The moment Robert began singing, Timothy's water-walking reached new heights of grace and power, as if the healing energy was amplified by the faith and love of everyone present. The medical implications of Timothy's transformation became apparent over the following days as his new abilities on the water translated into dramatic improvements in his movement on solid ground. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a physical therapist who had worked with Timothy for 3 years, was stunned when he arrived for his weekly appointment, walking confidently, without crutches for the first time in his life. "Timothy, what happened?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her professional composure cracking as she watched the boy who had struggled to walk 10 feet, now moving with the fluid grace of a trained dancer. "Miss Grace taught me how to walk on water," Timothy explained matter-of-factly. "And once you learn to trust water to hold you up, regular ground feels super easy." Dr. Mitchell's attempts to find medical explanations for Timothy's improvement led to a series of tests that revealed muscle tone, coordination, and neural pathways that bore little resemblance to his previous condition. From a clinical standpoint, it's as if Timothy received a complete muscular and neurological reset, Dr. Mitchell told Robert during their consultation. His motor function scores have improved by over 300% in just 1 week, which should be impossible without surgical intervention or intensive pharmaceutical treatment. When Robert mentioned Grace's water-walking ceremony, Dr. Mitchell's initial skepticism gave way to scientific curiosity about healing modalities that operated outside of conventional medical understanding. The expanding scope of Timothy's abilities began to attract attention from other children in their community who struggled with various forms of physical disability, leading to impromptu healing sessions at the Sterling estate that transformed their pool area into an unofficial healing center. Maria Santos, whose daughter had cerebral palsy, was the first parent to ask if Grace might help another child experience what Timothy had discovered on the water. "I've watched my daughter struggle for 6 years," Maria told Robert and Grace during a tearful conversation. "And I've seen what Timothy accomplished in just one afternoon. If there's even a chance that Sophia could experience that kind of freedom." Grace's response revealed the depth of her calling and the breadth of her healing abilities. Every child is different, and every healing unfolds in its own way. But love and faith are universal languages that every spirit understands. If Sophia's heart is ready, and if her parents can believe in possibilities that doctors haven't seen yet, then we can certainly try. The first group session, which included Timothy, Sophia, and 3 other children with various mobility challenges, created a scene that resembled something from biblical times as multiple children walked and played on the tarp-covered water while their parents wept and prayed on the pool deck. Grace moved among them like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of miracles, her presence somehow amplifying each child's faith while teaching them to support and encourage each other's healing. The transformation of the Sterling estate into a healing sanctuary attracted the attention of religious leaders, medical professionals, and media representatives who struggled to categorize and understand what was taking place in their affluent Connecticut community. Reverend Michael Washington, no relation to Grace despite the shared surname, from the local Methodist Church, was among the first clergy members to witness the water-walking ceremonies, and his theological training provided a framework for understanding the miracles that secular observers found inexplicable. What Grace is facilitating here is consistent with the healing ministry that Jesus demonstrated. Reverend Washington explained to a gathering of local pastors who had come to investigate reports of children walking on water. The physical healings are remarkable, but what's even more significant is the restoration of hope and faith that's taking place in these families. These children aren't just learning to walk. They're learning to believe in their own divine potential. The theological implications of the water-walking miracles sparked discussions throughout religious communities about the continuing presence of supernatural healing in the modern world, while the medical evidence forced healthcare professionals to grapple with phenomena that challenged their understanding of disability, recovery, and the mind-body connection. Timothy himself became an unwitting evangelist for the integration of faith and medicine, sharing his story with anyone who would listen and demonstrating his water-walking abilities for researchers, doctors, and religious leaders who traveled from around the world to witness what was taking place at the Sterling estate. The global impact of Timothy's story began to unfold as videos of his water-walking sessions went viral on social media, inspiring millions of viewers who saw in his transformation a symbol of hope for their own seemingly impossible challenges. "I never imagined that sharing Timothy's miracle would touch so many lives," Robert reflected as he read messages from families around the world who had found renewed hope through his son's example. Parents of disabled children, adults struggling with chronic illnesses, and people facing various forms of physical and emotional challenges wrote to express their gratitude for a story that reminded them that healing could come from unexpected sources and take forms that conventional wisdom couldn't explain. Grace, uncomfortable with the celebrity status that the viral videos had brought her, remained focused on the individual children who continued to arrive at the estate seeking their own water-walking miracles. "Each child who steps onto that tarp teaches me something new about faith and healing," she told Robert as they watched the latest group of young visitors discover their own abilities on the mystical surface. Timothy was just the beginning. His healing opened a doorway for other children to remember their own divine potential. The Sterling Pool had become a pilgrimage site for families seeking miracles, and Grace's water-walking ceremony had evolved into a movement that challenged medical orthodoxy while offering hope to those whom conventional treatment had failed. Timothy's journey from disabled child to water-walking miracle worker had transformed not just his own life, but the understanding of healing itself for everyone who witnessed his impossible achievement. Robert Sterling sat in his mahogany-paneled study at 3 a.m, staring at financial reports that suddenly seemed meaningless in light of what he had witnessed in his own backyard. His pharmaceutical empire feeling like a house of cards built on assumptions about healing that his son's miracle had completely demolished. The quarterly earnings projections and market analysis that had consumed his attention just days earlier now struck him as relics from a worldview that no longer made sense, replaced by the undeniable reality that a housekeeper with no medical training had accomplished in one afternoon what billions of dollars in research and development had failed to achieve. How did I miss it? Robert whispered to himself as he reviewed the extensive medical files he had compiled during Timothy's 8 years of treatment, searching for clues about why conventional medicine had failed where Grace's faith-based approach had succeeded so dramatically. Every specialist consultation, every experimental therapy, every pharmaceutical intervention now seemed like expensive distractions from the real healing that had been available all along through means that his education and experience had taught him to dismiss as superstition. The cognitive dissonance between his scientific training and the evidence of his own eyes created a mental earthquake that shattered his fundamental beliefs about reality, medicine, and the sources of true power in the world. As dawn approached, Robert made a decision that would have seemed insane just 1 week earlier. He called an emergency board meeting to announce his intention to redirect his company's research priorities towards studying and integrating traditional healing methods that operated through faith, community, and spiritual intervention. The reactions of Robert's business associates to his newfound interest in faith-based healing range from concerned bewilderment to outright accusations that he had suffered some kind of mental breakdown triggered by the stress of Timothy's condition and the guilt of being unable to cure him through conventional means. "Bob, you're talking about throwing away decades of scientific progress to chase after folk remedies and religious fantasies," declared Dr. Marcus Webb, his longtime research partner and chief scientific officer, during a heated board meeting that would ultimately determine the future direction of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. "I understand that you're grateful for Timothy's improvement, but we can't base corporate policy on unexplained phenomena that probably have perfectly rational explanations if we study them properly." Robert's response revealed the depth of his transformation. "Marcus, we've been studying Timothy's condition with the best scientific methods available for 8 years, and we made virtually no progress. Grace accomplished more in one afternoon than our entire research division has managed in nearly a decade. Maybe it's time to consider that our scientific methods are incomplete rather than dismissing results that don't fit our preconceptions." The argument that followed exposed fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of healing, the role of consciousness in physical health, and the relationship between quantifiable science and immeasurable forms of human experience that couldn't be reduced to data points and controlled studies. The transformation in Robert's personal relationships became evident as he began to see the people in his life through new eyes that recognized forms of wisdom and value that his business-focused perspective had previously overlooked. Grace, whom he had categorized as domestic help for 5 years, was now revealed as a master healer whose knowledge and abilities surpassed those of the highly credentialed medical professionals he had always deferred to in matters of health and healing. "Grace, I owe you an apology," Robert said during a private conversation in his study, surrounded by medical journals and pharmaceutical research reports that now seemed like monuments to his former ignorance. "I had you cleaning toilets when you should have been leading my research team. I paid you minimum wage when your knowledge is worth more than my entire medical library." Grace's response carried the gentle wisdom of someone who had never needed external validation to know her own worth. "Mr. Sterling, I wasn't here for the money or the recognition. I was here because the Lord told me there was a child who needed healing and a father who needed to learn that love is more powerful than logic. You didn't hire me to clean house. You hire me to clean hearts, starting with your own." The conversation marked the beginning of Robert's journey toward understanding that his wealth and status had actually blinded him to the most valuable resources that had been present in his own household, hidden in plain sight behind assumptions about class, education, and the sources of real authority. His marriage to Catherine also began to heal as they both grappled with the realization that their focus on Timothy's disability had prevented them from seeing his inherent wholeness and potential, and that their frantic pursuit of medical solutions had distracted them from the spiritual and emotional healing that their family had needed all along. The ripple effects of Robert's philosophical transformation began to manifest in his business decisions as he redirected Sterling Pharmaceuticals' research budget towards studying the intersection of faith, community healing, and medical outcomes. Dr. Jennifer Kim, a Harvard-trained physician who specialized in integrative medicine, was recruited to head a new research division focused on understanding how traditional healing methods could complement and enhance conventional medical treatments. What we're proposing here isn't the abandonment of science, Dr. Kim explained to skeptical board members during her first presentation, but rather the expansion of scientific inquiry to include variables that we've previously ignored or dismissed. If Grace Washington can facilitate healing outcomes that our current methods can't achieve, then we need to understand how her approach works and how we can integrate it with evidence-based medicine. The research protocols that emerged from this new direction were unlike anything the pharmaceutical industry had ever seen, combining rigorous data collection with respect for traditional knowledge systems and acknowledgement that some aspects of healing might operate through mechanisms that current scientific instruments couldn't measure directly. Robert's willingness to fund this unconventional research, despite vocal opposition from investors and competitors who saw it as a betrayal of pharmaceutical orthodoxy, demonstrated his commitment to pursuing truth over profit and healing over mere symptom management. The academic and medical community's responses to Robert's transformation and his company's new research direction created unprecedented dialogue between conventional medicine and traditional healing practices that had been marginalized by institutional healthcare for over a century. Dr. Michael Harrison from Johns Hopkins Medical School initially dismissed Sterling Pharmaceuticals' faith-based healing research as pseudoscientific nonsense. But his perspective began to shift when he witnessed Timothy's abilities firsthand during a visit to the Connecticut estate. "I came here expecting to debunk a hoax," Dr. Harrison admitted after watching Timothy walk on water for over an hour without showing any signs of fatigue or loss of coordination. "But I'm leaving with more questions than answers about the nature of healing and the limits of our current medical understanding." The documentation that Robert's team produced of Timothy's transformation, including before and after medical scans, physical therapy assessments, and neurological evaluations, provided evidence that even skeptical researchers couldn't ignore. Medical schools began incorporating case studies of Timothy's healing into their curricula, not as proof of supernatural intervention, but as examples of unexplained recovery that challenged students to remain open to possibilities that their training hadn't prepared them to consider. The Sterling Foundation for Integrative Healing Research, established with the proceeds from Robert's pharmaceutical fortune, became a bridge between traditional healers like Grace and academic researchers seeking to understand the mechanisms underlying faith-based healing. The personal cost of Robert's transformation became apparent as longtime friendships and business relationships fractured under the pressure of his radically changed worldview and priorities. His brother Michael, a cardiologist who had always looked up to Robert's business success, struggled to accept his siblings' embrace of what he saw as anti-scientific mysticism. "You've lost your mind, Bob," Michael said during a heated family dinner, his medical training making it impossible for him to accept the validity of Grace's healing methods despite the evidence of Timothy's recovery. "I don't care how much better Timothy is walking. There has to be a rational explanation that doesn't require us to believe in magic." Robert's response revealed how profoundly his understanding of reality had shifted. "Mike, maybe the problem isn't that we need to believe in magic. Maybe the problem is that we've defined magic as anything we can't control or commercialize, and we've forgotten that healing has always been about more than just fixing broken parts." The family rift that followed this conversation was painful, but also liberating for Robert, as it forced him to choose between maintaining comfortable relationships based on shared assumptions and pursuing truth even when it isolated him from his former peer group. Catherine, initially torn between supporting her husband's transformation and maintaining their social connections, ultimately chose to stand with Robert as she witnessed the positive changes in both Timothy's health and their family's emotional bonds. The global impact of Robert's transformation from pharmaceutical mogul to advocate for integrative healing began to manifest as other business leaders and medical professionals found the courage to explore healing modalities that they had previously dismissed as unscientific or commercially unviable. The Sterling model, as it came to be known in academic circles, demonstrated that successful integration of traditional and conventional healing required not just tolerance for different approaches, but fundamental shifts in how healing itself was understood and valued. What Robert Sterling has done, wrote Dr. Sarah Chan in her groundbreaking paper on paradigm shifts in medical practice, is show that the future of healing lies not in choosing between science and faith, but in finding ways to honor both the measurable and the immeasurable aspects of human recovery. Medical conferences began featuring presentations on faith-based healing alongside traditional pharmaceutical research, while hospitals started pilot programs that incorporated prayer, community support, and traditional healing practices into their treatment protocols. The transformation that had begun with one father's desperate love for his disabled son had evolved into a movement that was reshaping the entire healthcare industry's understanding of what was possible when love, faith, and science worked together rather than in opposition. Robert himself became a reluctant spokesperson for this integration, sharing Timothy's story at conferences and in interviews, while always emphasizing that the real credit belonged to Grace and the tradition of healing wisdom that she represented. The theological implications of Timothy's water-walking miracle forced religious communities to grapple with questions about the continuing presence of supernatural healing in the modern world and the relationship between faith, medicine, and divine intervention. Pastor David Kim from the New Hope Baptist Church, where Grace had been a member for over a decade, found himself fielding questions from theologians and believers around the world who wanted to understand how contemporary miracles fit within traditional Christian doctrine. What we're witnessing with Timothy and the other children who've been healed through Grace's ministry, Pastor Kim explained during a televised interview, is consistent with the healing ministry that Jesus demonstrated and that he told his followers to continue. The question isn't whether God still heals today. The question is whether we still have faith to recognize and receive healing when it comes through unexpected channels. The water-walking ceremonies at the Sterling estate began attracting pilgrims from various religious backgrounds who saw in Timothy's story a confirmation of their beliefs about divine power and supernatural intervention in human affairs. Grace, despite her discomfort with the religious celebrity status that had been thrust upon her, welcomed believers and skeptics alike to witness the healing sessions, always emphasizing that the miracles were not her own doing, but rather the result of faith, love, and community working together to create space for divine healing. The Sterling Estate's pool had become an unlikely interfaith sanctuary where Christians, Muslims, Jews, and people of various spiritual traditions gathered to witness and participate in healing experiences that transcended denominational boundaries while affirming the universal human capacity for faith-based transformation. Grace Washington's revelation of her true identity as a traditional healer opened doorways into an underground network of folk medicine practitioners who had been operating quietly throughout America for generations, preserving knowledge and techniques that mainstream medicine had dismissed as obsolete or superstitious. Mr. Sterling, Grace said as she opened her worn leather address book during their first formal consultation about Timothy's ongoing healing, there's something you need to understand about how this kind of work really happens. I'm not acting alone. I'm part of a community of healers that stretches back centuries and spans continents. The names and contact information in Grace's book read like a directory of hidden wisdom keepers. Sister Mary Catherine in Atlanta, who specialized in healing childhood trauma through prayer and herbal medicine. Grandmother Rosa in New Mexico, whose plant-based remedies could cure ailments that antibiotics couldn't touch. And Brother James in Detroit, whose laying on of hands ministry had reportedly healed everything from cancer to addiction. Robert listened with growing amazement as Grace explained how these healers communicated through prayer circles, community networks, and spiritual conferences that operated parallel to but separate from institutional healthcare systems. We've been here all along, Grace continued, her voice carrying both pride and sadness, helping people that hospitals couldn't help, healing conditions that pharmaceuticals couldn't cure, but doing it quietly because the world wasn't ready to accept what we represented. The revelation forced Robert to confront the possibility that an entire medical system had been functioning invisibly within American communities, achieving results that his industry's billions of dollars in research had failed to replicate. The first gathering of healers at the Sterling Estate brought together practitioners from 12 states whose diverse backgrounds and specialties created a living library of traditional medicine that challenged every assumption Robert had held about healthcare and healing. Sister Mary Catherine arrived from Atlanta with case files documenting hundreds of children who had overcome learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and chronic illnesses through her combination of educational therapy and spiritual intervention. The mind and the spirit aren't separate from the body, she explained to Robert during their introduction, her soft Southern accent carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years proving her methods through results. When children can't learn or can't behave or can't get well, it's usually because something in their spirit is wounded or blocked, and conventional medicine doesn't know how to address spiritual wounds. Grandmother Rosa's arrival from New Mexico transformed the Sterling Estates Gardens into an impromptu pharmacy as she identified dozens of healing plants growing wild on the property and explained their medicinal properties to fascinated observers. This land has been trying to heal itself, and everyone who lives on it, she told Robert as they walked among flower beds that suddenly seemed to pulse with therapeutic potential. But most people have forgotten how to listen to what plants are trying to teach them. The 3-day conference that followed brought together healing traditions from Native American, African American, Latino, and European folk medicine practices, creating conversations and collaborations that hadn't occurred for generations due to cultural separation and medical marginalization. The documentation project that Robert initiated to preserve and study the healer's knowledge created the most comprehensive archive of traditional American healing practices ever assembled, revealing the scope and sophistication of medical systems that academic institutions had ignored or actively suppressed. Dr. Patricia Williams, an anthropologist from Columbia University who specialized in indigenous medicine, was recruited to lead the documentation effort with explicit instructions to approach the healer's knowledge with the same respect and rigor typically reserved for conventional medical research. What we're discovering, Dr. Williams reported after 6 months of interviews and observations, is that these traditional healers have developed diagnostic and treatment protocols that are often more effective than conventional approaches for certain conditions, particularly those involving the intersection of physical symptoms and emotional or spiritual distress. The video recordings, written testimonials, and case studies that emerged from the documentation project revealed healing methods that operated through principles of community support, spiritual intervention, and plant-based medicine that had been refined through centuries of practical application. Grace's water walking ceremony was just one example of therapeutic techniques that combined faith, ritual, and natural elements to create healing experiences that mainstream medicine couldn't replicate or explain. The archive became a resource for medical students, researchers, and healthcare practitioners who wanted to understand how traditional healing could complement and enhance conventional treatment approaches. The integration of traditional healers into Robert's pharmaceutical research created unprecedented opportunities for collaboration between folk medicine and institutional healthcare, leading to breakthrough discoveries about the mechanisms underlying faith-based healing and community-centered therapeutic interventions. Dr. Jennifer Kim's research team began conducting controlled studies of the healer's methods, using brain imaging, hormone testing, and immune system analysis to document the physiological changes that occurred during spiritual healing sessions. What we're finding, Dr. Kim explained during a presentation to the American Medical Association, is that traditional healing practices often produce measurable improvements in stress hormones, immune function, and neurological activity that conventional treatments haven't been able to achieve. The collaboration between Grace and Dr. Kim proved particularly fruitful, as Timothy's ongoing water walking sessions provided a controlled environment for studying the relationship between faith, community support, and physical healing. Brain scans of Timothy during his water walking sessions revealed patterns of neural activity that suggested his consciousness was accessing states of awareness and physical coordination that normal waking consciousness couldn't achieve. It's as if the spiritual practices are literally rewiring his brain and nervous system. Dr. Kim reported, creating new pathways for motor function that bypass the damaged areas we originally thought were responsible for his disability. The research validated what traditional healers had always known, that healing involved more than just treating symptoms, requiring attention to the spiritual, emotional, and community factors that influence physical health. The expansion of the healing network beyond the original group of practitioners created a movement that began to transform healthcare delivery in communities across America, as hospitals and clinics started incorporating traditional healing methods into their treatment protocols. Dr. Michael Chong at Seattle Children's Hospital was among the first medical administrators to establish formal partnerships with local traditional healers, creating integrated treatment teams that combined conventional pediatric care with spiritual healing and community support. We started seeing dramatic improvements in patient outcomes when we began including spiritual healers in our treatment plans, Dr. Chong reported during a national conference on integrative medicine. Children who had been resistant to conventional treatments began responding when we addressed not just their physical symptoms, but their emotional and spiritual needs as well. The success of these integrated programs encouraged other healthcare institutions to explore similar collaborations, leading to the emergence of healing hospitals that offered both high-tech medical interventions and traditional healing practices under the same roof. Grace herself became a consultant to medical schools and hospitals seeking to understand how traditional healing could be incorporated into institutional settings without losing its essential spiritual and community-centered character. The challenge, Grace explained to administrators who wanted to replicate her success, is that this kind of healing can't be reduced to a technique or a procedure. It grows out of relationships, out of faith, out of love, and those things can't be institutionalized without being transformed into something completely different. The global recognition of the healing network led to international collaborations with traditional medicine practitioners from other cultures, creating opportunities for cross-cultural learning and the development of truly integrative approaches to healthcare that honor diverse healing traditions. Delegates from traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic practitioners from India, shamanic healers from South America, and African traditional healers visited the Sterling estate to share their knowledge and learn from Grace's methods. Healing is a universal language, observed Dr. Chun Wei, a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner who participated in the first international healing conference hosted at the estate. But each culture has developed its own dialect of that language based on their specific plants, their climate, their spiritual traditions, and their community structures. The exchange of knowledge that occurred during these international gatherings revealed common principles underlying diverse healing traditions. The importance of treating the whole person rather than just symptoms, the role of community and family support in healing, the use of natural remedies that worked with rather than against the body's own healing mechanisms, and the recognition that spiritual and emotional health were inseparable from physical well-being. Timothy's water-walking abilities became a demonstration that fascinated healers from around the world, many of whom recognized similar phenomena from their own traditions and shared stories of faith-based healing that transcended the limitations of conventional medicine. The legacy of the healing network that Grace had revealed continued to grow as former skeptics became advocates and practitioners of integrative medicine that honored both scientific rigor and traditional wisdom. Robert's transformation from pharmaceutical executive to healing advocate inspired other business leaders to examine how their industries might better serve human health and well-being rather than simply maximizing profits through symptom management. What Timothy's healing taught me, Robert reflected during his keynote address at the World Health Organization's Conference on Traditional Medicine, is that real healing requires humility. The humility to admit that we don't have all the answers, the humility to learn from people whose education came from life experience rather than academic institutions, and the humility to recognize that love and faith might be more powerful healing agents than any drug we've ever developed. The Sterling Foundation's ongoing research into traditional healing methods continued to produce evidence that faith-based healing and community-centered therapeutic approaches could achieve results that conventional medicine alone couldn't match. Timothy himself, Now a teenager whose water-walking abilities had evolved into a form of healing ministry for other young people with disabilities, embodied the potential for integration between traditional and modern approaches to health and healing. The pool where his miracle had first occurred had become a pilgrimage site for families seeking hope and healing, while the network of traditional healers that Grace had revealed continued to grow and evolve, creating new possibilities for healthcare that honored both the measurable and the immeasurable aspects of human healing and wholeness.